Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we're going to have a look at some textures to stylize buildings. I'm going to start off with some medieval buildings for now, and we're going to do a rooftop, we're going to do some wood, and we're going to have a look at some walls. And I used these textures to make these buildings for this Attack on Titan fan art I did. And I'm also going to have a look at how to make some of these basic masonry effects too. Looks like this. And this is going to be an introduction. So first I'm going to have this tips and tricks section, and then we're going to go over some concrete textures. So let's dive into it. As always, you can download the source files in the description below. And without further ado, let's get started. Alright, let's start this off with some tips and tricks on the brick texture. So I have this plane with a brick texture and an emission shader. And we're going to start stylizing this by adding a noise texture. And let's plug it into our mortar size. This is going to make it pitch black, but we need to add a mix RGB to control it. And we're going to set it to pitch black, bring it up, and this is going to control our effect. And this is going to give us some variation into the size of the mortar in between our bricks. So I'm going to copy paste this to show you another effect, is that when you take the noise and you bring it up, you actually get this distorted mortar. The nice thing is that it's super clean, it's which is really nice for getting a stylized effect. And we can combine the two. So actually, let's copy paste this again. We're gonna take two noise textures. I'm gonna set one to 80, the other to 5. I'm gonna add another mix RGB node. Oh, we're seeing the effect over here. We're gonna mix the two together. Now we can control the amount of the effect, but actually we're also going to add a color ramp, and moving that around will really allow us to get a lot of control over this effect. And so now we have both of the effects in place. We have some distortion of our mortar, which is small, and we also get this variation in the brick sizes, which is a pretty neat effect. Looks like it could be quite useful. Another way to get a similar effect is just, we're going to start off again with our brick texture. And this time we're going to bring up the smoothness. And we can also bring up our mortar size. And this is going to make our bricks look very soft. But that's okay. We're going to add a noise texture again. And this time we're going to mix it after the brick texture. And then we're going to add a color ramp. Now let's bring up the color ramp. I can set it to a constant. It's going to be easier. So this gives you the same effect we had earlier, but with just the mortar, where you get this variation, which can look pretty nice. I think this is pretty useful too for some stylized effects. Let's copy paste this, and so we can do the same thing, just lower the noise, and we get some more distortion for our bricks. And that way we can get some knife variations. And then there's one more thing I want to show you. is actually how to make some highlights and shadows for a stylized effect. And for this, we're going to take the brick texture, going to copy paste it. We're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, and we're going to add it to our second brick texture. We're going to add a mix RGB node, set the screen, and we're going to use this brick texture as our highlight. And so I'm going to take the color ramp of our first brick texture. Let's set it to a red color. Or let's set it to a gray color. And now let's plug in our brick texture into our screen. Let's also add a color ramp set to constant. Let's turn it around. So this is our highlight effect we're going for. Let's set the screen to max. And we are going to offset this one. So let's take our mapping node and let's offset it by 0.01 just to see what it does. Could be smaller, so 0.005. Let's try that. Well, it's about right. And then same for our Y offset. And then we can also add the distortion by mixing in our noise texture. We're going to have to set the mix the same, and we're going to have to adjust this setting. And so this gives us a bit of a shadow and highlight effect for our brick texture. And the cool thing is that it is just a 3-tone color. It's very clean, which is pretty nice. And you can go and stylize this a bit more by, for instance, adding a Voronoi texture. Mix it in with our original brick texture. I'm going to use the color for this one. And we're going to make it black and white using a color ramp. Let's up the scale. And we can set it to something like soft light. Now, of course, we've got all these hard edges, which is a bit too much. And something we can do is we're going to set this to smooth F1. And the smoothness controls the softness of the edges. And we're going to add a noise texture that controls the smoothness. And then we're going to also need a color ramp to control it a bit more. And so, as you can see, this controls it. And if you up the noise, you actually get some nice variations of soft and hard edges, which is pretty neat. And this creates a nice stylized brick texture, I would say. And we're actually going to use the same technique we did here on the Voronoi texture, and we're going to use it to create like a painted wall effect. So I'm going to add a plane. Let's add a new shader. Let's add an emission shader. And let's add a Voronoi texture. Plug in the color. And we're going to set scale to 20. And we're going to do a couple of things like before. So we're going to add a color ramp. to make it black and white. Set it to smooth F1. And like last time, we're going to add a color ramp. Plug it into the smoothness. We're going to control it with a noise texture. And then we're also going to add a mix RGB node. Set it to white. And so this also controls how much of the effect we're going to apply. You can also set it to black. This is, instead of making it blurry, we want less control. I'm going to make it sharper. And so let's bring up our noise texture. Let's bring down our mix and play around with the color ramp. And this gives this effect with some blurred edges, which is pretty cool. Now, if we take this color ramp and we bring it down, we can get this effect. That's not quite sharp, it's just broken up, which is the effect we're going for. Instead of a black, let's choose something like a gray. And let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And now if we scale this, we can get something that looks a bit like paint strokes. I'm also going to rescale our noise texture. Now to give it more of a squared look, I'm actually going to use a Chebyshev. And we can go from being completely sharp by using this mix and bringing in some distortion into those edges. And this gives us some stylized effect that looks maybe a bit like it's been painted. So if I bring back the color ramp like this, we've actually got something that looks or resembles paint strokes, which is pretty cool. Let me copy paste this. And we're gonna copy paste all these nodes. Double it up. Mix it in with each other. Seeing the effect over here. And so what we're gonna do is one, we're gonna scale the X value, and for the other one, let's set the X to 1 and bring down our Y value this time. And so we get this up and down stroke effect. Let's mix it in. And I think this is something that can be really, really useful for texturing things like concrete or walls. Maybe you think the strokes are a bit too small. You can bring it back, something like 0.2, 0.2. And let's scale this to 20, 20. Let's add a final color ramp to control everything. And as you can see, this can give us some like painterly effects, which is pretty cool and can be a really nice way to stylize things like walls or trees, or give like more of a painted effect. And if you combine it with other things like the bricks, I think you can get some really nice walls. And so this is just some studying of both the brick texture and some stuff you can do with the Voronoi texture. And I think up next we're going to dive into some concrete textures. Okay, now we're going to make a roof texture. So for this, I'm actually going to use the cube. I'm not kidding. So let's turn our cube into more of a plateau, scale it a bit, and let's go into our shader editor. Like always, we are going to add a emission shader, and we're going to add our first brick texture. So we're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, and we also want to turn this around. So let's set our rotation to 90 degrees, Z rotation. And this is going to be our base texture. Let's select some nice colors. We're going to take some orange for this one, a light orange, and more of a darker orange. And mortar we are going to leave to black for now. And we're not actually going to use the mortar. So let's set a mortar size to 0. And this is just going to be our color. And then we're going to add some nice things to this to stylize it. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a mix RGB. We're going to set it to multiply. And we're going to add a Voronoi texture. Plug it in. Let's add a color ramp. And let's actually plug in the color. We're going to set our scale to something like 21. And then we're going to set our Voronoi texture to smooth F1. And we're going to add a mix RGB, plug it into our smoothness. I'm going to set it to black. And we're going to add a color ramp and a noise texture. Let's up the scale on our noise. Maybe let's set it to something like 90. And we can't see the effect because we turned it off with our mix. And so when we bring that down, you can see the effect. And now we can control the sharpness of our corners by also using the color ramp. We want this more or less painterly effect. We can also make it even sharper or less sharp by using this color ramp. I'm gonna set it to a setting like this, and then I'm gonna bring it back a little. We just want a little bit of this effect. And actually, I'm gonna set the Voronoi to something like 35. Yeah, to get some more detail. Okay, next up, we're going to add a second brick texture, and we're just gonna copy paste our original brick texture, bring it down, and we are going to use this brick texture for the mortar. And so this time we're going to set our mortar size to 0.025. We are going to add this one in by using a multiply. We're also going to use the mapping node. And we are going to add a color ramp as well. Now we don't want these dark spots, so to get rid of these, we're gonna set our color to a color 2 to a white color, and now we're gonna distort it with our Voronoi texture too. And so we're gonna add a mix RGB, and we're gonna plug our color of our Voronoi texture into our mix RGB. We can bring it down a bit. And actually, I'm gonna set this color ramp to a brown color. And I want a bit of a smoother result, so let's set our mortar size to 15 maybe even 0.01. All right, this is looking pretty good. And now by controlling our mix and our color ramp, we can bring in either more or less of our shadows. Okay, I don't think I want as much contrast, so I'm gonna bring down the colors of our color a bit. All right, and next up, we're going to add a highlight. So let's copy paste our brick texture again. Let's add our mapping node. We're gonna set the color to black, our mortar to white. We're gonna plug it into our mix. I'm gonna set this one to a color dodge, and we are going to add a mapping, and this is going to offset our highlight. So let's set this to 0.02, 0.02, and let's also add a color ramp. Oh, I forgot our mortar size is off, so let's set this also to 0.01. That way we're gonna see some results. Okay, and now we need to set our offset. Let's try 0.002. That's better, maybe a bit more. All right, that's pretty nice. And we're gonna mix in a noise texture too. I'm going to add a color ramp, and I'm going to set the noise to something like 70. Set this to a constant, and let's mix it in. And instead of a mix, we're going to set it to multiply. All right. And so now we can mix in the distortion with our highlight. I'm actually gonna decrease the mortar size to 0.005. and the offset as well to get a more subtle effect. And this is sort of the effect we're going for. You can play around with the amount of distortion you want on the highlights. Maybe you just want some highlights, just some dots in there. And maybe you want more highlights, or you want some nice line effect going on. You can play around with it. Also, I'm using a color dodge. You can use some other effects like a screen, for instance. If you want a nice white line, it's too much for me. I want it to blend more. Let's try a soft light. Oh, this darkens it, of course. So yeah, I think a color dodge is having a nice effect. And this is going to be our roof shader. One thing you can do is we can add some input values, and for instance set it to our brick width and row height. So for instance, plug this into all of the brick widths. I'm going to copy paste this and do the same for the row heights. I'm going to set this to 0.25, and that way you can control the texture just using some parameters. And then also by playing around with the amount of texture you want, you can get some more variations on this effect. And so if this was a roof, we probably also want to add some shading. So to top this off, we're going to add a diffuse shader. A color ramp, a shader to RGB. And let's plug it into a mix RGB. Set to a multiply. Let's add a sun so we can see the effect. And there we have a shadow. If you want a nice stylized shadow, you can set the linear to a sharp effect, and that way, or even a constant, that way you can get a sharp shadow and just mix it in using a multiply. I'm going to add one more thing. I like to add a gradient as well. So I'm going to add a gradient texture, mix it in. Let's just plug it in and add it using a soft light. And this gives us this nice gradienting effect, which I really like. You can invert it if you want to. And this gives us a nice stylized roof effect. Next up, we're going to make a wood texture. And so I'm going to delete the light. We're going to keep the cube. Going to scale it up. And so let's go into our shader editor. And we're going to add a wave texture. And let's plug it into an emission shader. We're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Let's add the UV parameter. And we're going to set the bands to a Y value. And now what we can do is we can play around with the distortion, and this will give us more or less a wood type grain. And if we add a color ramp, set it to constant, we can make it a bit more two-tone or stylized. And so you can play around with the settings. Maybe you want more grain, you can play around with the scale. I'm going to set it to something like 6, and then you can also play around with the distortion until you like it. I think this is way too much. I'm going to set it to something like 20. Now what we can also do is add a noise texture. So let's add it in using a mix RGB node. We're going to have to adjust our color ramp, but that's okay. And it's going to punch some holes into our wood, so it isn't just straight lines that are distorted. I like this a lot actually, but you can like up the scale, something like 40 to get more details. And this is giving a very nice wood type effect. Alright, and so we can use this for the base of our wood. Let's give it a brown color. And I'm going to turn down the noise a bit. Another thing we can do is we can add a second wave texture. We're also going to distort it using the noise texture. So let's just plug that into a mix RGB node again. Plug it into our mapping. We're going to add it after our color ramp. We're going to set it to screen. And we're going to offset it. And this is going to create a highlight. Let's add a mapping node. Offset it by, well, let's first add a color ramp so we can see what we're doing. I'm going to set it to constant. And there we go. Okay. And we're going to offset it by 0.02. Let's see. 0.002 is better, I think. Yes. Let's change the color. And this can get us some highlight effects. Alright, I think I like this. And now to add onto this, we're also going to add a Voronoi texture. I'm going to set it to color. This is again going to create all these shapes. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Set it to UV maybe. Let's set it back to generated. We can play around with our scaling if we want to. And set it to smooth F1. And let's again add a color ramp and a noise. And plug it into the smoothness. Amp up the noise. Play around with this color ramp. Let's add another color ramp, and we can maybe set it to soft light. And this is going to create some variations in our wood. Maybe I actually like the stretched effect, so I'm gonna set the Z scale back to 1. Yeah, I think I like this. Starting to look good. And then depending on if you would like some color variation, you can always also add another mix RGB. Just take the color output, add it in. This is going to give like this rainbow effect, which is of course obviously way too much. But let's see if we can mix it in just a tiny bit. And if you just mix it in a little bit, the colors are just a little bit offset. It just gives a tiny bit of variation. Alright. And now we can still go back and tweak the distortion if we want to. But I'm gonna leave it at 20. And so one thing I'm also going to do here is I'm going to add a gradient texture. I'm gonna add a texture and coordinate node, rotate it 90 degrees. And then I'm just gonna set it to soft light. And again, it's gonna create that gradient shading that we like. And like last time, we're also gonna add a diffuse shader for the lighting. So it's a diffuse into a shader RGB, and we're just gonna add a color ramp. Mix it in using a multiply. And now we should have some shadows on our wood as well. And so this is a way to make more of a stylized wood. Depending on how much detail you put into it, it becomes more and more realistic, but it's quite easy to like tone it down by using the settings, for instance using less distortion. Let's set it to something like 5. And turn down the noise as well. You can get some really nice streamlined and stylized effects for wood. So next up, we're gonna delete the camera, delete the light, keep the cube, and we're gonna have a look at a shader for the walls. So I'm going to go into the shader editor, add an emission shader, and this time we're gonna plug in a Voronoi texture. Let's plug in the color. And we are going to set it to Chebyshev and smooth F1. We're also going to plug in a noise texture and plug it into our smoothness. And we're going to add a color ramp. And this is going to control the noise. Let's size this up a bit. We can add a texture and a mapping coordinate node. Actually, if you want some uniform scaling, we can add a geometry position into the location. This is going to resize everything, so we're going to have to adjust the scale. But now when we resize our texture, it's going to remain, all the procedural effects are going to remain the same. And we're going to add a color ramp. And I'm going to set this to very similar colors. Next up, we're going to add a Musgrave texture. And we're going to mix it in. And so let's set the scale to something like 2.9. Let's up the detail to 10 and set dimension to something like 1. And this gives this more detailed effect. And we're going to add a color ramp. I'm going to set it to first of all, I'm going to plug in our Musgrave in the upper node. And then we're going to make this more of a beige color and a brown color. And I'm going to mix in this in-between color, just so I have control how much noise I have. And then our mix I'm going to set to soft light. Maybe I'm going to get more contrast on that Voronoi texture. Now I can use it to distort this. And I have some parameters to play around with it. Okay. That's maybe a bit too yellow. But something I can always do is just add a hue and saturation layer. And I can always desaturate it afterwards. And then something we can also do is just add a mix RGB. And like last time, I'm just going to add a gradient texture. Add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And again, we're going to turn it 90 degrees on the y-axis. And let's mix this in using a soft light. Let's have a look at this texture we have here. If you want this squared effect, you can use Chebyshev, but you can go to Euclidean to get more of a spotted effect. Something you can also do is you can change the scale. To get more of a banding effect. If you want more streaks, I actually like this quite a lot. This looks quite useful. So I'm gonna set this to 1 again. And depending on the colors you use, this I'm gonna use for my medieval house. But if you make this a grayscale, this could be a good stylized way of making things like concrete, or you could use it even for some earth effects. We might do that later and in another tutorial. And now I'm also going to add a diffuse shader to RGB. And we're going to mix it in to get us some shadows. And again, we're going to cut it off using a color ramp to get a nice clean edge. And set it to multiply. Also, if you like the soft light effect of the gradient, but you like to have more of it, you can just add another mix node. Just set it to soft light, and you can mix it in again, and you can just get more of the same. This is really like burning out the texture, but maybe want just a little bit more. And then also a tip is you can always colorize the shadows as well. So if you want more of a blue hue on the shadow, you can just go in and use the blue shadows, and that's what I like to use a lot. Combined with the gradient overlay, I think that gets a nice result. All right, and that sort of concludes our 3 textures that we made. I hope you can use these textures for your own buildings, or at least use these as starting blocks to get your own textures, and you might paint over them or use them for your own buildings. I used them for this Attack on Titan building that I'm gonna also add to the source files. And I hope you like this tutorial. I'm gonna do some modern buildings too in the future, so stay tuned for that. And if you like this tutorial, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.